What would you do if you had been trapped for months in a floating wooden prison, eating worm-eaten biscuits and drinking foul water? If the captain's whip was the only law and your wages a promise that never came? What would you do if, on the horizon, you saw a black flag, and instead of fear, you felt a strange pang of hope? Smell the mixture of tar, sweat, and sickness that permeates your bunk. Feel the burn of scurvy sores on your gums and the dull ache of malnutrition in your bones. Hear the ceaseless creaking of timber and the whistle of the wind, interrupted only by the choked cry of a shipmate as he struck with the cat-o'-nine-tails. Now contrast that misery with the image of a fast, lethal ship closing in. Bearded men, their eyes bloodshot, screaming not orders, but an offer, a life of rum, gold, and freedom, in exchange for your soul. This is not an adventure fantasy. This was the real and brutal choice faced by tens of thousands of sailors between 1690 and 1730. What you are about to hear is not the legend of Jack Sparrow. It is the visceral chronicle of life aboard a pirate ship, from bloody mutiny to the gallows, revealing the social system and the hidden economy behind the Jolly Roger. To understand the golden age of piracy, you must feel the salty, corrupt air of the Caribbean in the early 18th century. It was not an accident of history. It was a perfect storm, born of three deadly ingredients. First, peace. The end of the War of the Spanish Succession in 1713 was a catastrophe for thousands of men. They were privateers, legalized pirates who had served the British crown, harassing Spanish ships with the king's permission. Overnight, these sea dogs, trained in violence and masters of their own vessels, found themselves unemployed and desperate. Second, hell at sea. Conditions aboard merchant vessels and Royal Navy ships were a nightmare. The food was a breeding ground for maggots and weevils. Diseases like scurvy and dysentery killed more men than any battle, and discipline was a reign of terror, maintained through sadistic punishments. Death was not a risk, it was a constant companion. Third, opportunity. The Caribbean was a geographical funnel, the choke point for the richest trade routes on the planet. Entire fleets loaded with Peruvian silver, island sugar, and the darkest cargo of all, slaves from Africa, sailed these waters. With its thousands of islands, secret coves, and ports with corrupt governors, it was the perfect hunting ground. In this breeding ground, one place became the capital of the underworld, Nassau, on the island of New Providence, the infamous Republic of Pirates, an anarchic haven for the most wanted men in the world. No one is born a pirate. You become one, by desertion, by mutiny, or most often, by capture, seeing in the black flag not a threat, but an unlikely escape from a slow, miserable death. Put yourself in the boots of a merchant sailor. You've been at sea for months, enduring abuse and starvation. Suddenly, you hear the distant sound of a cannon shot. The lookouts cry, "Sail ho!" You see a pirate sloop, a low, fast, and deadly vessel, closing at an impossible speed. Panic grips your ship. The captain screams orders, but it's too late. You hear the thud of grappling hooks biting into the deck's timber. Seconds later, a human roar. Dozens of men swarm aboard, a whirlwind of steel and fury. They are armed with cutlasses, axes, and pistols strapped to their chests. The air fills with the overwhelming smell of burnt gunpowder and the stench of rum. The famous choice you're offered, join us or die, is only part of the myth. The reality is more complex. For the ship's officers, especially captains known for their cruelty, death is often swift and certain. But for you, a common sailor, the offer is genuine and often welcome. Men with valuable skills, carpenters, surgeons, coopers, are frequently offered the fiction of being forced to join. This gives them an alibi, an excuse that might save their necks if the ship is captured by the Royal Navy. The true strength of piracy was not its violence, but its immense power of recruitment among the oppressed of the sea. Imagine the scene through your own eyes. You have just watched your captain, the man who flogged and starved you, be unceremoniously thrown overboard. The initial terror gives way to a strange sense of justice. A bearded pirate with a gap-toothed grin puts a cutlass in your hand and offers you a swig from his rum bottle. He tells you that from now on, a share of the plunder will be yours. For the first time in your life, you are not a servant. You are a shareholder in a very dangerous enterprise. Your old life has just ended. A new one, much shorter but infinitely more intense, is about to begin. Far from being an anarchic mess, a pirate ship was one of the most surprisingly fair and democratic societies of its time. It was bound together, not by a captain's tyranny, but by a social contract every man aboard signed, the Pirate Articles. Imagine the crew assembled on the main deck. There are no officers shouting orders. There is a heated debate as they elect their captain, and, more importantly, they elect their quartermaster. Then, a parchment is presented. Most can't read or write, so they make their mark next to the rules. Rules they themselves have agreed upon. No fighting on board. Disputes will be settled ashore with pistols or swords. Lights out at 8. No women or boys allowed on the ship. Desertion or stealing from a shipmate is punished by marooning or death. This was a revolutionary power structure. The captain, whom you just elected, only has absolute authority in the heat of battle and during a chase. All other major decisions, which course to take, whether to attack a sighted ship, how to divide the plunder, are made by a majority vote. One man, one vote. The quartermaster, also elected by the crew, is the true day-to-day power on board. He is the one who distributes rations of food and rum. He is the one who settles minor disputes. And he is the one who represents the crew's interests to the captain. He is the check and balance that prevents any abuse of power. There is even a system of compensation for workplace accidents, a kind of primitive health insurance. Losing your right arm in combat guarantees you 600 pieces of 8, an eye, 100. Everything is stipulated in the articles. As a new pirate, you witness something incredible. A conflict between two crewmen is not settled with a whip, but with an impromptu trial led by the quartermaster. You receive your share of the first prize, a full share, the same as almost everyone else. The captain, for his leadership and risk, typically only receives 1.5 or 2 shares. This experience of justice, equality, and democracy was utterly unthinkable in the tyrannical world of the Royal and Merchant Navy from which you just escaped. The Jolly Roger was not just a flag, it was a sophisticated tool of psychological warfare. Every famous captain had his own design, his own personal brand of terror. There was the skull and crossbones, popularized by Emmanuel Wynne, one of the first to fly it. There was Blackbeard's skeleton, holding an hourglass in one hand and a spear pointing to a bleeding heart in the other. A clear message. Your time is up. And there was Calico Jack Rackham's skull with 2 crossed cutlasses, a symbol of no quarter. The black flag was, in reality, an offer of mercy. Its message was, surrender now, give up your cargo, and you will likely live. It was an invitation to avoid bloodshed. But if the ship refused to surrender, the pirates would sometimes hoist a second flag, the red flag. Its message was unequivocal and terrifying. No quarter will be given. We will fight to the death, and if we win, we will leave no survivors. The flag was a pirate's first and most effective weapon, and pirates rarely buried their treasure. Gold and jewels were a small part of their plunder. The bulk of it consisted of far more mundane goods: sugar, tobacco, cloth, timber, spices, and, most sinister of all, slaves captured from slave ships. To turn these stolen goods into hard cash, they needed an underground economic network, a black market of corrupt merchants and complicit governors in ports like Port Royal in Jamaica, before its destruction by an earthquake, and above all in the pirate Republic of Nassau. These middlemen would buy the stolen goods at a fraction of their real value, laundering the money and, in return, resupplying the pirates with gunpowder, ammunition, food, and, of course, rum, preparing them for their next raid. A pirate's life was a roller coaster of wild extremes. Long, endless periods of unbearable boredom at sea, punctuated by brief, violent moments of pure terror and adrenaline. And all of this was followed by explosions of self-destructive debauchery on shore. Imagine the weeks under the scorching Caribbean sun, the sticky heat, the clouds of mosquitoes, the hypnotic, endless rocking of the ship, the monotonous diet of salted meat, as tough as wood, and weevil-infested biscuits. Tension and irritability grow among the crew, violent men trapped in a confined space, and suddenly, the cry that changes everything: sail ho! In an instant, the lethargy transforms into an explosion of frantic activity. Men run to their stations, prepare the cannons, sharpen their cutlasses, check their pistols. Adrenaline drowns out the boredom. Then, Imagine the brutal contrast upon arriving at a pirate haven like Nassau. It is hell and paradise at once. The sound of raucous fiddle music and drunken laughter mixes with the shouts of brawls. The air smells of roasted pig, spilled rum, and desperation. You see men spend months' worth of plunder in just a few days of gambling, drinking, and whoring. The pirate philosophy was simple and direct, a short life and a merry one. Most knew their careers wouldn't last more than 2 or 3 years. Death by the gallows in battle or from a tropical disease was always just around the corner. There was no incentive to save or plan for the future. Wealth was not an end in itself. It was a means to immediate, explosive, and total gratification. Our pirate, now a veteran of several boardings, wakes up on a beach in Nassau. He has a thundering hangover and empty pockets. The hard-won gold has vanished in a haze of rum and dice. But the memory of those days of absolute freedom, of being the master of his own fate, remains. The only way to recapture that feeling, to be king for a day again, is to go back to sea. It is a vicious, addictive, and almost always fatal cycle. A pirate's greatest asset was not his cannons, but his reputation. And no one understood this better than Edward Teach, the man the world would come to know as Blackbeard. He was a master of psychological warfare, a genius of terror marketing. Imagine his figure boarding your ship. You don't see a mere man. You see a carefully orchestrated spectacle. His enormous black beard, braided with colorful ribbons. And most terrifyingly, slow-burning cannon fuses, lit and tucked under his hat. The smoke swirling around his head gives him the appearance of a demon emerged from hell. Slung across his chest, he wears a bandolier with not one but several pistols, loaded and ready to fire. To the terrified crew of a merchant vessel, he does not look like a man. He looks like an apparition, a monster. This image was a deliberate construction. Blackbeard's goal was not to fight, it was to intimidate his way to unconditional surrender. And his method worked perfectly. The vast majority of the ships he encountered surrendered without a single shot being fired. Actual violence was bad for business. It damaged the ship you wanted to capture. It could spoil the cargo, and worst of all, it could injure or kill members of your own crew, who were your shareholders. Terror was simply a tactic of economic efficiency. Now, see the scene through the eyes of a merchant captain. You've heard the stories about Blackbeard, stories he has no doubt helped spread himself. You see his flag, that skeleton with the spear, and then you see that demonic figure, wreathed in smoke, leaping onto your deck. You know your underpaid and demoralized crew has neither the chance nor the will to fight. Surrendering is not an act of cowardice. It is the only logical choice. Blackbeard's legend has done all the heavy lifting for him. But every rebellion has its nemesis. And for the Republic of Pirates, it was Woodes Rogers, a former privateer turned governor of the Bahamas, with a single, clear mission: to clean out the Vipers, nest of Nassau. Rogers did not arrive with an overwhelming war fleet. He arrived with a much more powerful and subtle weapon, the King's pardon, an offer of a full amnesty for any pirate who renounced his life of crime and swore allegiance to the crown. This offer was a bombshell that shattered the pirate community from within. It divided former allies and turned them into mortal enemies. Some, like the pragmatic Benjamin Hornigold, one of the founders of the Pirate Republic, accepted the pardon. Overnight, they went from being the most feared pirates to the most effective pirate hunters, using their knowledge to track down their former comrades. Others, like the unyielding and violent Charles Vane, spat on the King's offer. For them, it was a betrayal of everything they stood for. Vane declared open war on Rogers and the Crown, becoming the symbol of pirate resistance, a man who preferred the gallows to kneeling. The arrival of Woodes Rogers and his pardon marked the beginning of the end for the Golden Age. The anarchic utopia of Nassau collapsed under the weight of betrayal and the promise of a longer, albeit less free, life. The Golden Age of piracy was a bright, but incredibly short, flame. For almost all its protagonists, from the most famous captain to the most anonymous sailor, the end was the same: a violent death and an unmarked grave at the bottom of the sea or at the end of a rope. Imagine Blackbeard's final battle. Cornered by Lieutenant Maynard of the Royal Navy, he fights with superhuman ferocity on the deck of his own ship. It is a desperate and bloody hand-to-hand combat. The sound of steel clashes again and again. Blackbeard keeps fighting even after being shot 5 times and suffering more than 20 sword cuts. It is a final demonstration of the legend he himself created, until he finally falls, decapitated. Or imagine the execution of Calico Jack Rackham. The crowd throngs the harbor to watch the spectacle. You hear his last defiant words, and then you see his body, and those of his crew, tarred and hung in cages at the harbor entrance. A macabre and permanent warning to anyone who dares to hoist the Jolly Roger. The combination of the king's pardon, a massive increase in Royal Navy patrols, and the systematic hunting of the most notorious figures crushed piracy in less than a decade. The Republic of Pirates was dismantled. The law and order of empires returned to the Caribbean. Our pirate, the man who once chose freedom, is finally captured. As he stands on the gallows, the noose around his neck, he has no regrets. In his few years as a pirate, he lived with more freedom, more equality, and more intensity than in his entire previous life. His last words are not a plea, but a final challenge to the system that first oppressed him, and now will destroy him. Imagine for one last moment a beach in Nassau at sunset. The taverns are quiet. The ships flying the Jolly Roger no longer fill the bay. All that remains is the echo of their drunken sea shanties, the ghost of their savage freedom, and the skeletons hanging at the harbor entrance. A grim reminder that every rebellion, however glorious, has an end. The story of the golden age of piracy is a paradox. It was an era of thieves and murderers, yes, but it was also one of the greatest experiments in democracy and workers' rebellion in history. They were a brutal response to an even more brutal world, a spark of liberty that, however brief, illuminated the cracks in the absolute power of kings and captains. If you had been an abused sailor in 1715, would you have accepted the risk of joining a pirate crew in exchange for a short but free life? Or would you have endured the tyranny in the hope of survival? Tell us your choice in the comments. If this journey has shaken you, subscribe to Steel Chronicles. Here, we don't just tell history, we relive it.